Hello, YouTube, and welcome to today's show. I'm going to be talking today about Pascal's wager. So this is going to be a more kind of formal video, perhaps, than the kind of open hangouts or interviews and conversations. And the intention for this video is to walk through the argument and its main contours, and take a look at how it's been developed more recently as well. I'm not going to come to any kind of overarching conclusion about the argument. I'm going to broadly leave that up to you, and hopefully I'll highlight all of the relevant considerations to kind of give you guys the tools to do that for yourself. Okay, so what's in today's show? Firstly, I'm going to talk about some conceptual tools that we're going to need to be able to evaluate the argument and understand it. Then I'm going to talk about the wager itself. So this is the original formulation of the wager as it tends to be understood by Pascal. Then we're going to talk about the many gods objection to that version of the wager. We'll talk about the mixed strategy objection, and then we'll talk about the salvaged wager, which is the version that Jackson and Rogers, that's Liz Jackson, for those of you who are familiar with her kind of online presence. That's the version of the wager that she kind of has advocated for. Okay, so a note on method then. I'm going to be kind of avoiding the debate how to faithfully interpret Pascal, because obviously Pascal's an historic philosopher, and so he's writing in a particular cultural context, and he's not writing in English and so forth. I mean, I think the Pensées is written in French initially, but I think it's published in Latin as well, and scholars will debate back and forth about how to really understand what he's saying. I'm just going to go with a kind of mainstream position on interpretation as Pascal has been understood by the vast majority of contemporary Anglo-American philosophers. So that's the way I'm going to engage with the argument, and I'm sure that people who are interested in looking into the hermeneutics of Pascal or whatever will find different interpretations. Okay, so conceptual distinctions and tools. So the first thing that we're going to have to understand is practical reason, because the wager proposes to be, or the advocate of the wager proposes to be giving someone good practical reasons to believe that God exists. So practical reason is the general human capacity for resolving through reflection the question of what one is to do. So it's to do with action and how we ought to act, what's rational for us to do in our acting. So practical reason might best be understood by contrast to theoretical reason. So according to the SEP at least, and again, all these things are contested in philosophy, but broadly conceived, theoretical reason is going to be about explanation, belief, and prediction. So some kind of hallmarks of theoretical reason are that it's kind of impersonal, it's abstract, it's scientific, it's about propositional knowledge and so forth, modeling the way that reality is. By contrast, practical reason is about action. So practical reason is more personal and it's normative because it's supposed to be about how we ought to act, or what the best course of action is for one to take. So I don't know if I had, so on the next slide, it's basically going to be about value as well. So like what do we actually want to get out of a situation? What ought we want to get, and things like that are going to come under practical reason. So we're also going to have to know some basics about probability, decision theory, and rationality, that is practical rationality. So broadly, again, decision theory analyzes risky decision making using ideas from probability theory and of utility. So probability here is going to be about what we think will happen. So there's going to be, we're going to assign certain probabilities to certain outcomes. And then utility here is going to be about the kind of value that we place on certain outcomes and what we actually want to get from those outcomes. So I'm actually just going to move this on my computer. Yeah, that's not going to affect anything for you guys. So probability, decision theory, and rationality. So David Papineau, this is his book, Philosophical Devices, where he talks about a bunch of tools for doing philosophy if people are interested. Talks about some of these concepts. Agents have subjective degrees of belief toward how different actions will lead to different outcomes that lay before them. So each action available to an agent, in this case, let's just say, to believe P or not P, because that's what we're supposed to be doing in the wager, is associated with the utility of taking that action under each state of affairs that could possibly obtain. So an agent, who we're going to call S in this case, is practically rational if and only if S has subjective degrees of belief towards P and not P. That is to say, the available actions that lie before them. In this case, we've just restricted ourselves to P and not P, that are in line with the axioms of the probability calculus. So, I mean, this is usually going to be Kolmogorov's axioms, which is what Papineau gives, but there are other sets of probability axioms available. Again, these are the sorts of things that philosophers will debate about, which are the axioms we should be using. And the idea here is that the person is going to hold their credences such that they're in line with the probability axioms, so Dutch books can't be cooked against them. And we'll talk about what that means in a second for a Dutch book to be cooked against someone, like why that's a bad thing. And S chooses, and then suppose that S has all of their credences in line with these with the probability calculus, so that Dutch books can't be cooked against them. Then the idea is that the practically rational choice for S to make is whichever action yields the greatest expected utility. So the idea here is that these are each is a necessary condition, and they're jointly sufficient for practical rationality. So holding your credences in line with the axioms of probability theory and acting such that you yield the most expected utility. So in standard decision theory, the expected utility of an action is the sum of each of S's degrees of belief toward a possible state of affairs, multiplied by the utility of taking that action when the state of affairs obtains. And again, this will become clearer when we look specifically at the wager in like a decision matrix, which I've laid out. So here are the Kolmogorov's axioms of probability. So for any proposition, the probability of that proposition is greater than or equal to 0. So it's it's not going to be a negative number, and it's less than or equal to 1. So it's not going to have like a probability of higher than 1 of occurring. If P is certain, or some people might say if P is necessary, epistemically necessary, then it's going to have an assignment of 1. If P and Q are incompatible, that is to say they're independent, then the probability... Why have I used PR in some cases and P in other cases? That should be PR there on 3. If P and Q are incompatible, then the probability of P or Q is the probability of P add Q. Okay, so why is it irrational not to have credences in lines with the axioms of probability calculus? I'm actually not even sure. Let me see. Are those axioms correct? I'm thinking something's suspicious now. Axiom 3 is the one I'm questioning. Axiom 3. Disjoint events, then the disjunction is them added. Yeah, so that is right. Okay. Dutch book arguments. Why is it irrational not to have credences that are in line with the axioms of the probability calculus? Well, anyone who violates the axioms of the probability calculus can have a Dutch book cooked against them. A Dutch book would be a set of bets which are guaranteed to win whatever the outcome. So that would mean the person who's placing the bets that allow a Dutch book to be placed against them would be losing. They're guaranteed to lose no matter what the outcome is. So the idea here is that it's practically irrational to adopt attitudes where it's possible that you're guaranteed to incur a loss whatever happens. So a couple of examples of this. Suppose that some subject S believes that the probability that it will rain is 0.6 and the probability that it won't rain is 0.6. So obviously here they are violating axiom number 2, because if P is certain, so the idea here is that P or not P should add up to 1. But in this case, it is greater than 1. So they're violating the axioms here. And suppose that this person is going to place a bet about whether or not it will rain. According to the probabilities that they've assigned, this person will accept odds in the betting where they would place 60p to win a pound that it will rain, and they'd also place 60p to win a pound that it won't rain. That means they've paid £1.20 on their bets, yet whatever the outcome, whether it's raining or not, S will win at most £1. So no matter what happens in this case, S is guaranteed to lose, not lost, as I've written here, 20 pence. So by not having credences in line with the probability axioms and acting upon those beliefs, S is guaranteed to lose. This is why an agent whose beliefs violate the axioms is called incoherent. One whose beliefs align with the axioms is called coherent. So again, you might be thinking, okay, so that's just because P or not P, exceeds 1. But what if they had credences such that, P or not P was less than 1? So if we violate finite additivity such that the probability of P or not P is less than 1, we still have the same problem. So suppose S believes that it will rain is 0.2 and that it won't rain is 0.2. So overall, P or not P, which should be a tautology and be assigned 1, is 0.4. In this case, S can bet 80p against P. So given that, the probability of P is 0.2, that means that the probability of not P is 0.8. And so, they bet 80p against P in order to win a pound. And they'd also bet 80p against not P in order to win a pound, given what their assignment towards not P is, not P then should be given 0.8. And so they'd bet 80 pence to win a pound. As such, in this case, they would spend £1.60 in order to win a pound, and they're guaranteed to lose 60 pence. Because at most they're winning a pound, but they've spent £1.60. So the Dutch book theorem is that given a set of betting quotients that fail to satisfy the probability axioms, there's a set of bets with those quotients that guarantees a net loss to one side. The converse Dutch book theorem is for a set of betting quotients that obey the probability axioms, there is no set of bets with those quotients that guarantees a sure loss to one side. Now, that's to say there is some, so it could be the case that you're guaranteed a loss, but of course, you also might not incur a loss. But the idea is that that possibility that you're guaranteed to incur a loss is what makes it practically irrational. If you're interested in more on this, I would recommend reading the SEP, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry, which talks about Dutch book arguments. So the Dutch book argument basically states that a practically rational agent requires coherence. But beyond that, it leaves it to subjective opinion which particular degrees of belief you should adopt. So the idea is that as long as you're in line with the probability axioms, you can basically assign any subjective credences towards certain beliefs. Now, there are some other things that Papineau talks about in the book, considerations such as the principal principle, which is the idea that we ought to bring our subjective credences in line with objective credences if we have those available. So say, we have a fair dice which has 6 ways it can land or something, then we ought to bring our subjective credences that any given roll will be a 3 in line with the kind of objective probability in that case. And then there's various different ways of thinking about all these things in philosophy of probability, which I'm not going to get into for here. But the minimal kind of thing that we're concerned with is that the Dutch book argument shows that agents require coherence. So they have to have their credences in line with the axioms of the probability calculus that we're employing. Okay, so let's move on to the wager. So here's Pascal talking about the wager. I'll just read the whole passage. If there is a God, he is infinitely incomprehensible, since, having neither parts nor limit, he has no affinity to us. We are then incapable of knowing either what he is or if he is. This being so, who will dare to undertake the decision of the question? Not we who have no affinity to him. Who then will blame Christians for not being able to give a reason for their belief, since they profess a religion for which they cannot give a reason? Let us then examine this point and say, God is or he is not. But to which side shall we incline? Reason can decide nothing here. There is an infinite chaos which separated us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance, where heads or tails will turn up. What will you wager? According to reason, you can do neither the one thing nor the other. According to reason, you can defend neither of the propositions. You must wager. It is not optional. You are embarked. Which will you choose then? Let us see. Your happiness? Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, that he is. And of course, I've kind of paraphrased and not paraphrased, sorry, but I've clipped out certain parts of the quotes, and the full section there is section 229 to 234 of Ponce's. For those who are interested in going and reading the full thing. So here's a few things that Pascal talks about then. If there is a God, he's infinitely incomprehensible. So this is actually, the orthodox Christian understanding of God, that God's essence is unknowable because it's beyond human reason. That, the truths of the Christian faith about God's essence, about God's nature, have to be revealed by him, actually, because, reason kind of can't reach them. Even though, some Christian authors will say that reason can go so far in kind of establishing that there is a God, but no, knowing really who God is kind of incomprehensible. And there's a debate there within Christian theology about how far reason can go, and Pascal here is obviously more pessimistic about whether reason can kind of decisively decide or decisively know God and his existence. So he says, they profess a religion for which they cannot give a reason. But to which side shall we incline? Well, reason can't decide anything here, according to Pascal. According to reason, you can do neither the one thing nor the other. According to reason, you can defend neither of the propositions. Because on the hypothesis that, God exists, it's the kind of God that Pascal's describing, it's perfectly expected that his essence or nature is unknowable. Theology is apophatic in its nature. So Pascal claims a game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance, where heads or tails will turn up. What will you wager? You must wager. It's not optional. You're embarked. Which will you choose? And so the idea here is that just by the nature of being alive, you're placing a wager. If you kind of say that you're going to withhold assent, well, then you're making a decision, right? Not to wager that God exists. So just by being alive, according to Pascal, you're playing the game, and you have to place a bet either way. Your hand is forced. You sort of can't you can't decide not to play. So then Pascal says, let's consider your happiness and weigh the gain and the loss in either case. So if you gain, that is to say, if God exists, then you gain everything. But if you lose, then you lose nothing. And the idea is that we can basically put this in a decision matrix. So we've got here in this first column two actions. One is belief in God and belief in not God. And it's worth remembering that there is an assumption taking place here that strict belief like this is a kind of action that someone can take, rather than something that sort of happens to them or something. And we'll talk about that a bit more as we go on. So then we have the kind of value, supposing that God exists. Well, the value, just in case we believed, is infinite. The value in case we didn't believe is negative infinity. Supposing a kind of eternal conscious torment version of hell. The value, if God does not exist, however, is finite in the case. It doesn't really matter what we assign here, and I'll talk about why in a second. And the value, just in case, we believe not God, is finite. Now, the reason that I haven't assigned probabilities to the state of affairs if God exists and the state of affairs if God doesn't exist in these column headings. So ordinarily, for like a kind of finite sum, we would multiply the value in this case where God exists by a probability, and then we would multiply the value in this box here by the probability, and then we would sum those two products together in order to get the expected utility of taking that action. But in the case of these infinite values, the idea is that basically like any number by an infinity just is infinity. And so it kind of doesn't matter about the finite values. We can just ignore them and we're going to get infinity. And so that's going to make, in this case, our expected utility infinity. And in the case where we don't believe in God, the expected utility negative infinity. And so the idea is that believing in God is an action that strongly dominates not believing in God. As I've written at the top here, epistemic probability of God existing or God not existing are kind of irrelevant in this case because the infinity just absorbs everything by straight multiplication. So as I said, there are several assumptions that are being made in this decision matrix. So one is that belief is an action. So this assumes belief. That's a weird way that I phrased that. Assumes belief is a kind. What I should have said. This assumes a kind of radical doxastic voluntarism. So the idea is that I can kind of just will myself to believe things either way, rather than my beliefs kind of being strange things which are influenced by a number of factors which are quite outside of my control, I suppose. And now there are responses that theists can make to this claim. They can say, well, actually, the rational thing to do then is to act in a way that you think is probably going to kind of cultivate the religious passions, so maybe going to church and so forth. And this is something Pascal talks about himself. But the question I want to raise then is, I mean, is this assumption just too much of an oversimplification then for how we should model our available actions within a decision theoretic framework? So this idea that we just, believe God or believe not God, what actually happens if we assess the actions that we have available before us? So things like, going to church and how likely that is to bring about belief, and then the probability that God exists and so forth. I mean, maybe we just need a bit of a more complicated model. Another thing is that this decision matrix assumes that live options for God are ones within which the deity punishes or rewards someone on the basis of performing the action, believe that. Now, of course, there are different versions of theology, Christian and not Christian. So Christian universalist theologies, which will believe that everyone's going to kind of be saved in the end anyway, so everyone is technically going to get infinite utility, or that God's going to reward people on the merit of certain actions, whether or not there will be many on that day who confess with their mouth, Lord, Lord, sort of as the Bible says, who won't go to heaven. Another thing is that this assumes a non-zero credence in God's existence. So suppose that actually, your credence towards God existing was zero. Well, 0 times infinity is just 0. And so you're not going to get this kind of infinity absorbing everything. And another point that is raised by Oppie in arguing about gods is that this also assumes some non-infinitesimal credence towards God's existence. So suppose, our credence towards God's existence was 1 over infinity and then multiplied by infinity. Well, they're just going to kind of cancel out. And in that case, again, you're not going to get the effect of the infinity kind of absorbing everything, giving you these infinite expected utilities. So those are some sort of thoughts about the assumptions going on in the way that Pascal's wager is being put forward here. But there are two main objections that really undermine the wager as it's traditionally conceived. These are the many gods objection and the what's the other one? Mixed strategy objection. I put these slides together a few days ago, so I'm trying to remember. Okay, so the many gods objection then is the first one. So the idea of the many gods objection is just that there are many different models of God which might exist, and that this changes the possible outcomes in the decision matrix. This also changes the number of possible outcomes. So what I mean is that this is going to change the number of rows and columns in our decision matrix if we go back to this. So it's basically claiming that this is just a bad way of modeling the situation. Also, because there's more states of affairs now which might obtain, it's going to change the expected utility at the end for the action of believing God or not God. So, suppose we introduce now the Christian God and the Islamic God. And again, this is still going to be an oversimplification. So Bell A is believe atheism, by the way. So suppose we believe in atheism. We've got, negative infinity, and finite, just in case no gods exist. And again, I'm assuming here finite credences towards each of these propositions that aren't infinitesimally small. And so we can just, they get multiplied out by the negative infinity. And that just gives us negative infinity expected utility in the case that we take the action to believe atheism. That's this row here. But now consider believing Christianity in the way that that's changed. So Christian God exists, some non-infinitesimally small finite probability multiplied by infinite value yields infinite infinity, yields infinite expected utility. But just in case the Islamic God exists, right, which we have a non-infinitesimally small credence towards, well, that's going to be a problem because now believing in Christianity in this case is going to yield us negative infinity. Finite just in case no gods exist, so we can kind of ignore that. And so our expected utility is now positive infinity add negative infinity, and that's kind of messy because of the ways that subtraction is defined for transfinite arithmetic, and so it's just not clear actually what the expected utility that we get is anymore as a result. And the same happens for Islam. If we believe in Islam now, when the Christian God exists, well, we get negative infinite expected utility because the Christian God is going to punish us for that, according to this decision matrix. But we believe in Islam just in case the Islamic God exists. Well, actually, again, this model's still not quite good enough because Muslims do believe that God might still send you to hell if you're not a good enough Muslim. But, suppose you believe in Islam, potentially at least you're going to get that infinite expected utility. And we end up with this expected utility of infinity add minus infinity. And it's just not clear what we should actually do. I mean, maybe you could still sort of weasel around and say, well, atheism is clearly the worst option because at least that's kind of like clearly negative infinity. But we could introduce more and more of these different models of God into the decision matrix, such that it's going to kind of look like there's a lot more negative infinities on the expected utility for each of these options than there are. And it's just going to kind of look bad either way, right? And so what the many gods objection does is it just kind of makes us, it's either going to make us think that these believing in any particular religion option don't strongly dominate anymore. So it's not clear that one is more practically more rational than the others, or it's going to just leave us in a position where we're unable to make the decision because this subtraction of the infinity is undefined. So the second objection I talked about is the mixed strategy objection. So what's a mixed strategy? Mixed strategies basically boil down to the claim that there's some action or set of actions not included in the decision matrix, but these should be considered because they lead to the same expected utility. So, the idea is that they lead to achieving that infinite reward of heaven. So mixed strategies do not involve wagering for or against God outright. And so the idea here behind the mixed strategy is going to be that any action we can find with a non-zero probability of leading to the condition that yields infinite value will count as a kind of competitor action for us to take, because it'll just get straight multiplied by that infinite utility, just in case God does reward us. And then it's going to give us infinite expected utility for taking that action. So if these strategies yield the same expected utility as wagering for God, then wagering for God is not rationally required. So that's one way of thinking about the mixed strategy, is that it's going to provide us with a strategy that yields the same expected utility as wagering for God. So wagering for God is not rationally required. Another way of thinking about these is also that they can kind of offer a reductio of the wagers methodology, i.e., its inclusion of infinite utilities in the decision matrix. Because the idea is going to be that if we, the kind of broader critique that the mixed strategy objection raises is that if we include these infinite utilities in our decision matrix, then it's just going to lead to these absurd consequences where essentially any action that we take that has a non-zero probability of yielding the infinite expected utility overall is as rational as any other. So suppose there's a non-zero probability, a non-infinitesimal probability, I should have put as well, that if I jump out of my window, I'll paralyze myself, and as the result of my suffering, I'll convert to a religion and believe in God. As long as there's a non-zero probability that such an action will lead to this outcome, we can multiply that probability by the infinite value granted by God in heaven, giving that action an infinite expected utility. Examples such as these are clearly absurd cases of irrational behavior, like jumping out of my window just right now. So we should reject the wagers methodology, which includes these infinite utilities. And it's not just the example of jumping out of my window. You could say, and I have in an essay on my blog, for example, talked about, it could be that I go to the strip club, right, and I and spend all my money, and going bankrupt then and having a conversation with someone about God is just the right condition that converts me to belief in God, and so I get the infinite reward. Or tying my shoelaces, right? Flipping a coin and saying, if I flip heads, I will wait. If I flip heads, I'll believe in God. If I don't, I won't. But actually, there's some non-zero probability that me not wagering on God, if it comes out tails, will actually lead me further down the line to form belief in God. Because if I hadn't done that, there's some counterfactual about me, like going to church and making a relationship or something that then leads to me believing. So the result is that pretty much any action has some non-zero probability of leading to me forming the belief in God. And so pretty much any action, again, has the same infinite expected utility. And this is just an absurd consequence. And so we should reject the wagers methodology of including these infinite utilities that lead to these absurd consequences. Okay, so it is widely considered that these considerations make the traditional wager inoperable. Now, in response to this, in Philosophia Christi in 2019, Elizabeth Jackson and Andrew Rogers published this paper, Salvaging Pascal's Wager. So here's the abstract from Jackson and Rogers' paper. Many think that Pascal's wager is a hopeless failure. A primary reason for this is because a number of challenging objections have been raised to the wager, including the many gods objection and the mixed strategy objection. We argue that both objections are formal but not substantive problems for the wager, and that they both fail for the same reason. We then respond to additional objections to the wager. We show how a version of Pascalian reasoning succeeds, giving us a reason to pay special attention to the infinite consequences of our actions. I apologize to any dogs or cats who are listening who have been triggered by my mentioning of Spain. So the purpose of this paper is essentially to salvage a form of the Pascalian reasoning and giving us reasons to pay special attention to the kind of infinite consequences of our actions, or to the consequences of our actions over the longest possible time spans, one might say. So here's another quote about the purpose. When we say we're salvaging the wager, we take the goal to be providing a decision theoretic apparatus that gives us strong decision theoretic reason to pay special attention to possible infinite goods and harms in the afterlife. So the idea is that if Jackson and Rogers' considerations are to be accepted, well, then we still have to kind of pay attention to what we think about considerations of various theological stories about the afterlife and our credences towards them in deciding what's practically rational for us to do. Okay, so here we go. In order to address both of the objections at once, both objections in this case being many gods and mixed strategy objections, we propose that one deal with infinity differently than it's dealt with in the standard formulation of the wager. So that's the one that I've just described. In the standard formulation, the agent's credences are multiplied by infinity for the worldviews offering infinite rewards, and as long as the credences are positive, this always leads to an infinite expected value. We suggest a reformulation to how the quantities of infinity are compared. So what Jackson and Rogers do in this paper is they're essentially going to suggest a different way of modeling things rather than the straight multiplication by infinity. So here's the proposed framework then. I'll just read this bit of the paper again. So they talked, it says the second way in which we deal with infinity here, and this is just because they wanted to talk about different ways of thinking about infinity. So we might think about like quantitative infinity, we might think about qualitative infinity, we might think about infinity per time, or infinity at any given time, or infinity, over an infinite amount of time, finite amount over an infinite amount of time. And those were the first considerations. But the second way in which we want to deal with infinity, differently than in the original wager, is that we want to focus on finding the ratio in the limit between two or more rewards, instead of simply multiplying everything by infinity. Section 3 explained how it can be rational to prefer one infinity to another. That is, an infinity of a different kind of quality. So suppose, I think, if I'm remembering right, because I haven't put this in the slides or anything, in section 3, they talked about, for example, suppose that there are two heavens. One gives you an infinite quality of pleasure at every moment for an infinite duration of time, right? And then imagine a finite amount of pleasure, but for an infinite duration of time. Well, they're saying, clearly it's rational to prefer the one where you get an infinite quality for an infinite duration of time to like a finite one. So these considerations about different aspects of infinity and pleasure are going to kind of modify the way that we should think about the wager. So measuring different infinite rewards using ratios and limits will enable us to capture the intuition that one infinite reward can be better than another. Our proposal is to find what the ratio in the limit between the two options would be. Instead of multiplying the two finite amounts of utility by an infinite amount of time, we propose multiplying them by larger and larger amounts of time until one finds their ratio in the limit. So the ratio, what is the ratio in the limit here? So the ratio in the limit is just going to be over the longest time span. How do the ratios between these different options begin to play out in terms of the utility that they're yielding? And this might become clearer as we go on. So the idea is that they're going to be able to, for each given worldview, define a kind of function curve for the expected utility over time. So the idea is going to be that each theological narrative, they provide several, including Islam, Christianity, Universalism, Platonism, Buddhism, and atheism. They're going to have a kind of function curve for expected utility. So atheism, for example, might say that, okay, suppose you're going to live until you're 80. Well, you'll get like this amount of utility per day until you're 80. But then after that, you don't get anything, right? Whereas theological stories with an afterlife, you might continue to receive utility, or you might, positively or negatively, suppose, you're having bad experiences or being punished or something after the time at which you die. Now, certain narratives like Platonism might say that there's a short finite period of time, and then maybe the soul is destroyed after that amount of time or something like that. And then other theological narratives might maintain that there's a finite period of punishment, after which there's, an infinite extended amount of time of a certain kind of pleasure. And so these are each going to produce a different function curve where at different times there'll be different amounts of expected utility. And the idea is that we play these out over the longest time span and see what the different values are that we get, and there will be a ratio between those different values at the limit, as it were. So here's a table just to provide an interpretation of this table. So A is atheism, U here is universalism, PL is Platonism, Buddhism. I think M is Mormonism, H Hinduism. is Islam, and C is Christianity. And so you have the expected utility, just in case each of these is correct. And you can see at the top as well that they've assigned credences towards each one of these available positions. And so they've multiplied the credence by the value, just in case each one turns out to be true, and summed them across to get the expected value at the end of each column. And then looking at this, you can clearly see by looking in the expected value column at the end that atheism over 1 year returns the most expected value. So after 1 year, atheism appears to be the clear winner. This is mostly due to atheism being given the highest credence. We now factor in time periods. First, we will multiply every value by 100, which will give us the expected values of each worldview after 100 years. This gives us the same ratio of expected values as the above matrix, since every worldview has a reward/punishment time period that lasts at least 100 years. So this comes back to what I was saying about how in each worldview, the kind of functions of reward and pleasure vary over time according to different theological or atheological narratives. So they come to 10,000 years in, where they claim, because of the differing theological narratives about what happens, the time period to 10,000 years has drastically changed our results. Atheism now has the absolute lowest expected value. And if we look across the atheism row, what we can see is, so they got a kind of finite amount of reward, right, for being an atheist, presumably during their lifetime. And also, if universalism is true, then they've got some amount of reward as well, which is going to go into the sum. But on pretty much every other worldview, they're getting a lot of punishment. So Platonism, Buddhism, Mormonism, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity, they're getting some punishment from all of these, and so the longer that kind of goes on for, the worse it gets for the atheist, unfortunately. Universalism also looks terrible, although it's no longer dead last. Platonism and Buddhism have moved to the top 2 spots, thanks to their high credences and the fact that they haven't hit their afterlife timeline ceilings yet. Next, we multiply each value with a time period greater than or equal to 100 trillion, by 100 trillion. Something I found interesting about this as well was that, it's assumed that if you believe in universalism, then the Christian God, for example, will punish you. Whereas I would expect that you could believe in universalism and be a Christian in the Christian. But so that would be something perhaps to include in a more thorough modeling. And also, you could believe in Christianity according to some Muslims, and the Islamic God wouldn't punish you, for example. And so I think that there's some nuance in different theologies which should be taken into account in these, which hasn't been. So it's still a bit of an oversimplification, even though it's now perhaps more accurately modeling what it's trying to do. But let's continue. So they just keep kind of multiplying the values in the theological stories out by bigger and bigger times until they get to this crazy time of 100 Googleplex years, which is where they claim the limit is. So as we multiply by larger and larger numbers, the ratio of the expected values will even out to this number. So that's to say, as we go down the expected value column for each worldview, right, there's a ratio between each of the values, and they claim, obviously not just they claim, you can see from the numbers that they've assigned that the ratio between each is 2, 2, 2, 2, 4, 4, 5, 3. And so the highest number here, the one with the highest amount of expected utility, is this 5, which means that in order to maximize expected value, the person Peter, who they've given in this example, ought to choose Islam, because at the limit, Islam is the worldview which yields the greatest expected value. Okay, so let's talk about the salvaged wager and the many gods objection. So firstly, it does include many gods. And so, it's sort of getting round a part of the objection, which maintains, the oversimplification that there aren't different competing theological stories included in the decision matrix. There are still questions about what happens for any given person when they consider all of their live options. So this is, this table here that they've produced is for someone who has these particular live options. But any given person might have very different live options available to them. They might think that, Mormonism just isn't a live option. It gets, assigned 0. Whereas they might also think that, machine elves that grant, which hasn't been included here, is a different live option, and that's going to yield a different expected utility function over an infinite amount of time. So there are still questions. It's not like this table provides the answer for what is practically rational for anyone to do. Supposing that Jackson and Rogers have succeeded in showing that we should take their considerations into account and reason in this way, any individual person is then going to have to go away and look at what the live options are for them and figure out which yields the greatest expected utility at the limit. So yeah, questions about whether it's a purely subjective matter, what should be considered a live option. And there are still some remaining concerns, I think, from the many gods objection. So, for example, completing theologies and how they play out. So some of the things I was mentioning about, Islamic views where Christians wouldn't be punished, or views which might say that universalists don't get punished or do get punished. And again, it seems like they're not being considered in this case, but for a great number of people at least, so that might mean that there's clearly like winning strategies, like universalism. If there are plausible candidate Christian and Islamic theologies where universalists aren't being punished, that could actually end up making universalism a dominating strategy, as it were. Another issue with this would be the idea of kind of hindsight bias and the idea that someone could concoct a dominating theology. Now, the obvious objection to this concern would be that that's, poorly motivated and recherche, and that so what you should actually do is assign a credence of somewhere near 0 to that. But I mean, supposing someone has a non-zero credence towards a concocted dominating theology, and what I mean by a concocted dominating theology is just one where God gives someone like an inordinately high amount of utility on any given day for believing in that view, and an inordinately high amount of punishment for not believing in this particular theology. And what I mean by inordinately there is just whatever number is bigger than any of the other theologies, right? Well, then, that theology is clearly going to win. And my claim will be as well that theists can also essentially modify and concoct their theology in such a way that it's going to kind of win when it's put through this sort of heuristic that Jackson and Rogers are proposing for seeing what has the highest expected value at the limit. And so there's just going to be this concern about hindsight bias and what that does here in evaluating these different theological models. They also talk about something called atheism plus as a live option and what that does for atheists. But what I'm going to talk about something slightly different, which I'm going to call the God of epistemic responsibility. Now, the God of epistemic responsibility, according to me, is going to be a model of God which rewards people for doing the epistemically responsible things. So for developing such virtues as epistemic responsibility, that is to say that they essentially look into all of the kind of available options and believe what they believe about theology according to the best their lights of reason can do, and that might mean that they become an atheist. And this God is going to reward people on that basis, the basis of epistemic responsibility, but not the basis of whether they believe in him or not. Now, I happen to believe that there are actually as well plausible Christian and Islamic conceptions of God which include this notion of epistemic responsibility. But I think at least for the sort of friendly atheist, right? So someone who doesn't just hate religion or whatever, who's thinking about theology and matters of philosophy of religion philosophically, and they're considering a priori or something like this, what a good God would be like, what kind of things a good God might reward or care about, that something like this, Sanzani revealed theology, something like this notion of rewarding epistemic responsibility is something that it seems really likely, actually, that a good God would reward, rather than kind of arbitrary things like whether or not someone believes in them, which is kind of hard to evaluate how those things are morally relevant. And so, it might actually be the case that, something like believing for the atheist, believing in this God, the option, of this God of epistemic responsibility is going to modify the overall expected utility, such that something like atheism just remains the epistemically responsible choice for them to take. Jackson and Rogers sort of talk about this line of response with atheism plus, which is something similar. So they say, people with a sufficiently high credence in atheism plus should thus remain atheists. And I want to kind of applaud that, because they're just kind of following the argument where it goes, which is what people should be doing. In this, if one thinks that salvaging the wager requires a theistic position to win, then they may not find our project satisfying. However, then they say, however, for most people, atheism plus will lose out to another infinite worldview in which they have a higher credence. Now, I'm not sure where they get that for most people from, because again, I think I just disagree, right? And I think it's then an empirical question which we have to go out there and actually ask people about. I think that most people, if asked, like, about models of God and what they think about plausible candidates for a God, will think that something like rewarding people for the virtue of epistemic responsibility is something that a good God would do. And I say we just need to go out there and test that, right, to see whether it is actually the case that for most people it will lose out to another infinite worldview. So I sort of disagree with that sentence. And another thing that I want to say, though, about this is it raises the question of, supposing Jackson and Rogers are correct, that they've salvaged the wager, but what they have also done is they've kind of undercut any apologetic relevance for the argument, right? Because they're saying here, well, the problem is that because people are going to kind of differ in what they consider live options, people are just going to have different things that it's practically rational for them to believe in then in that case. And that might not be, Christianity or Islam, or however the argument is being put forward in an apologetic context. Now, that's a problem because for apologists, because they want to salvage the argument for the purpose of apologetics, right? But if the argument itself doesn't actually guarantee a theistic conclusion, well, then Jackson and Rogers haven't really salvaged the wager for these people. They've actually, undermined their use of it. Okay, I'm just going to have a quick little drink. So how about the mixed strategy objection then? They talk about any mixed strategy approach, such as flipping a coin and then believing the worldview if heads, which is what I talked about in the mixed strategy section, can be included in the decision matrix. However, so claim Jackson and Rogers, none of these mixed strategies will ever have as high of an expected value as simply converting to the worldview with the highest expected value of the coin flip. So that, this is just a simple function of the fact that as long as you're not, as long as the mixed strategy has a credence less than 1, then you're multiplying by that number that's less than 1. And so it's going to be less than just converting, right, on the basis. So this is because one needs now to multiply the value per year by the credence, by 0.5, the probability of getting a heads, if that was the mixed strategy. But I mean, there's other mixed strategies which are less certain, which are more certain, sorry. And this mixed strategy will change the final ratios, privileging the pure strategies over the mixed ones. That is, unless someone, and I'm sure that someone can do this, can come up with a plausible mixed strategy where it's certain, right, of the outcomes. Which again, again, you could kind of maybe do this reductio where, you come up with this strange list of actions which are all certain that someone has to do, and the believing in God, and it just kind of is sort of bizarre. But yeah, it seems like by and large they have done away with the mixed strategy objection here. So, in conclusion, then, I'm not going to really weigh either way about whether or not you should kind of take the wager, right? But I think that there are some interesting considerations here. Maybe it might be worth for people thinking about what you consider to be a plausible kind of candidate theology and multiplying it out, what you consider to be plausible live options for theologies, and thinking about their expected values over time and multiplying them out over a crazy amount of time to get what the ratio at the limit is, and just seeing what it would be practically rational for you to do. I mean, maybe that would be an interesting thing to do. That being said, right, I myself have not done this, and I'm honestly not sure if I did, that I would be like, oh yeah, I ought to take the option with the highest value now. Like I just don't care. Now maybe that kind of makes me irrational in it. Maybe that makes me practically irrational. I'm not sure. I'm just sort of, so what I'm saying here is I'm not sure what the force of the argument is for a person like me who just doesn't care. And maybe the accusation is that, in that case, I'm just irrational. But maybe for some people, these considerations are really important, and they are going to kind of motivate them to adopt a particular worldview, given that it yields the highest expected value over a really, really long amount of time at the limit, as it were. Some of the considerations are that I kind of think, the force of this argument is just not there for apologists to use this argument and claim that it rationally compels, any atheist to, or non-Christian, say, to adopt the belief that God exists. I mean, as Jackson and Rogers themselves in the paper say, someone who has the relevant credences towards atheism plus ought to remain an atheist. Someone who has the relevant credences, which include Islam, ought to actually be a Muslim in that case. And so the apologetic project seems to be undermined, firstly by the use of the traditional wager with the many gods and mixed strategies objections, but then also with the salvaged wager, in that it doesn't kind of guarantee the theistic conclusion that the apologist wants to establish. Okay, so that concludes this video. Just to say thank you everyone for watching, and also thank you to all my patrons who support me on the channel. So your names are up on the screen now: Robert Belair, Kim Ernut, Massimiliano Zatera, Mo, I'm not sure what your full name is, Roman, Jerry Pena, Mike Apple, Victor Ludadorm, Stacy, Scotty, Margaret De Velden, Kieran CJ, Dirth Funk, Michael Haggy, Ash6, Nick Golden twice, or did I? No, I included that twice. Nick Golden once, John Camacho, Yana Adame, Kali, Rebecca Davis, Mitch Mazarol, Eric Edgerton, James Fodor, Nathaniel Briner, Gary McCurchie, and Elor Chess. So thank you for your support, everyone. It really helps me as a content creator, so I appreciate all of that. If you want to support the channel, you can do by going to patreon.com/digitalgnosis. And the lowest tier is just £3 a month. So the more that you that do that, the more it kind of adds up for me to help. And if you think, £3 a month, it's just basically nothing. It's like a cup of coffee, and that enables me to get a cup of coffee. So thank you. I hope you have learned something, found something useful from the video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Goodbye.